The millionaire's son was covered in painful sores, a skin condition that no treatment could cure. The father watched helplessly as the boy suffered. That's when a simple cleaning lady was hired. One day, the father heard his son screaming in pain from his room. He entered and saw the cleaning lady applying a paste from a strange bottle on the boy's sores. When he picked up the bottle to read the label, his blood ran cold. There was a skull symbol, indicating poison. Without hesitation, he picked up his son and rushed immediately to the hospital, convinced the woman had poisoned his boy. But the revelation the doctor gave him next left him in complete shock. Arthur's empire was a fortress of glass and steel, built on an undeniable talent for turning numbers into power. He was a titan of Wall Street, a multi-billionaire whose fortune multiplied in stock market shares and complex cryptocurrency investments that few understood. His net worth was vast, a mountain of capital that secured him a place among the most influential men in the country. Yet, within the walls of his mansion, that fortress crumbled. The man's heart, once filled with the love of his late wife, was now a silent ruin, echoing only with the pain of his only son. Leo, the boy, a fragile 8 years old, was the heir to all that wealth, but he lived like a prisoner in his own body. Mysterious sores, which no expensive treatment or renowned specialist could heal, spread across his delicate skin, turning his childhood into a torturous cycle of itching and inflammation. Arthur, a widower carrying the weight of guilt for his son's condition, had transformed the house into a sterile sanctuary, an extension of the most modern hospital his money could buy. Every hallway smelled of disinfectant. Every surface gleamed under a cold, impersonal light, and commanding this aseptic kingdom was Beatrice, the head nurse, a woman whose methods were as rigorous and sterile as her forced smile. She supervised Leo's diet, medications, and routine with an efficiency that bordered on cruelty, treating the boy more like a complex clinical case than a child in need of affection. Amid this atmosphere of calculated despair, a new housekeeper was hired. Her name was Isabella. She arrived on a grey morning, bringing with her the soft scent of damp earth and the quiet calm of someone who understood nature's silent cycles. Her hands, though calloused from work, were gentle, and her deep brown eyes seemed to see beyond appearances, while Beatrice saw in Leo a professional challenge, a chronic condition to be managed. Isabella saw something different. She saw a small child whose life force was being suffocated, whose body was waging a ceaseless war. And from the first moment she entered the boy's room, she felt a deep, unsettling intuition that the enemy was not an internal disorder, but something external, something hiding in plain sight. The journey that would unfold over the next month was destined to unearth a poisonous truth hidden beneath layers of meticulous care, and to cultivate, in the ruins of that home, a love that no one could have predicted. Isabella was led by Beatrice through the silent corridors. The nurse pointed out tasks in a monotone voice, explaining the strict cleaning protocols, especially in Leo's room. Upon opening the door, Isabella saw the boy curled up in bed, the skin on his arms red and raw. The smell of chemicals in the room was almost suffocating, overpowering any other scent. Beatrice approached the child with a jar in her hand. "Time for your cream, Leo," she said, with that smile that never reached her eyes. Isabella watched, standing by the door, and her heart ached. She noticed the boy flinch subtly at the nurse's touch and the strong odor emanating from the ointment, a synthetic scent that struck her as strangely aggressive. In that instant, a seed of doubt was planted in her mind. She didn't know what, but she felt, with a certainty that made her skin crawl, that something here was terribly wrong. In the days that followed, Isabella immersed herself in the silent routine of the mansion, a world apart, governed by the ticking of expensive clocks and the omnipresent smell of antiseptic. She moved through the vast rooms like a discreet shadow, her gestures methodical and efficient. She polished the cold marble, vacuumed the Persian rugs, and cleaned the glass panes that framed a flawless but lifeless garden. While her hands worked, her mind observed. She saw Arthur, the patriarch of that empire, leave every morning in his luxury car, his face etched with a worry that not even all his wealth could hide. Occasionally, she would hear him on the phone in his lavish study, his firm voice speaking of investments, hedge funds, and the fluctuation of stocks, a universe of figures and strategies that seemed light years away from the contained suffering in the room upstairs. He was building an inheritance of incalculable value, yet the sole heir lived in daily torment. Isabella began to notice a disturbing pattern, a cruel tide that ebbed and flowed in Leo's suffering. In the morning, when she entered to clean his room, she would find him listless, his skin irritated but relatively calm. He spent the day in a quiet lethargy, reading or assembling puzzles, his small hands often pausing mid-air as if hesitant to touch his own skin. The real agony, the storm of itching and pain, invariably arrived after nightfall. It was a macabre clock, and Isabella knew exactly when the alarm would sound. It happened every night. Right after Beatrice performed what she called the nightly protocol. With cold efficiency, the nurse would apply the imported medicinal ointment, a thick cream with a penetrating chemical odor, and administer a supplement for sleep, a liquid from a small, dark bottle whose label was indecipherable, written in a language Isabella didn't recognize. During that first week, Isabella made a point to be nearby during this ritual, hiding in the dim light of the hallway. Pretending to organize the linen closet, she watched. She saw Leo shrink from Beatrice's touch, his small face contorting into a grimace of anticipated pain. And, invariably, an hour or two later, when the house was plunged into silence, she would hear it, the muffled sound of nails scratching skin, followed by a restrained cry that broke her heart. It was the sound of torture, and it repeated with the precision of clockwork. One evening, at the end of her shift, Isabella was in the pantry. Putting away her supplies, she felt exhausted, not from the physical labor, but from the weight of her helpless observation. Her eyes landed on a high shelf where the strongest cleaning products were kept. There was an industrial solvent in a can covered with countless hazard warnings, which she was only allowed to use with thick gloves. Moved by a sudden impulse, a morbid curiosity, she took down the can. Carefully, she twisted the cap just enough for a sliver of an opening. The scent that escaped was caustic, chemical, aggressive, and terribly familiar. Her blood ran cold. It was the same odor as Beatrice's ointment, only more concentrated. The similarity was unmistakable, a hideous truth that hit her like a punch to the gut. The revelation left Isabella breathless. That night, and for many that followed, sleep became a stranger. She would lie in her modest bed, in the small apartment that was her refuge, and the chemical smell of the industrial solvent seemed to permeate her sheets, her mind, her dreams. It was the scent of Beatrice's ointment, the fragrance of Leo's agony. The initial doubt had morphed into a terrible certainty that weighed on her chest like an anchor. But what could she do? She was a simple housekeeper against a head nurse with impeccable credentials. Hired by a man whose power was measured in digits she could barely conceive. Arthur was a billionaire, a man who traded the fate of companies and the flow of international capital with a single phone call. To approach him with a suspicion based on a smell seemed delusional, an act of foolishness that would surely cost her the job she desperately needed. During the day, she tried to get closer to Leo. She would offer him a glass of water with a gentle smile, fluff his pillows with extra care, ask quietly about the puzzle he was working on. They were small gestures, fragile bridges she tried to build across the boy's chasm of isolation. But Beatrice was always there, a sentinel in white. She would appear silently, the sterile smile on her face, and interrupt any attempt at connection. "The boy needs his rest, Isabella, Not conversation, she would say, her voice as smooth as silk, but as sharp as glass. Please, stick to your duties. The message was clear. Isabella was invisible, a functional part of the house, and her role did not include human interaction. The boy, conditioned by the rigid routine, barely looked up, as if the hope of affectionate contact was something dangerous. Fear was a constant companion for Isabella. Fear of losing her job, fear of being humiliated, fear of being terribly wrong. But what truly paralyzed her was the fear of what would happen to Leo if she did nothing. The image of the boy, curled up and suffering night after night, overshadowed all her personal fears. The scales of her conscience teetered dangerously between self-preservation and compassion. The turning point came on a Thursday night. Isabella had finished her work and was about to leave when she remembered she had left a cleaning cloth in the bathroom of Leo's room. Reluctantly, she climbed the stairs silently, hoping not to disturb anyone. The bedroom door was ajar, and a dim light emanated from within. Before she could knock, a sound stopped her. It wasn't a loud cry, but a low, continuous moan, the sound of a pain that no longer has the strength to scream. She peeked through the crack. Leo was sitting up in bed, his back hunched, his cotton pajamas stained in a few spots. Under the lamplight, she saw his small hands scratching his own arms with a desperate ferocity. His eyes squeezed shut as silent tears streamed down his pale face. Beatrice was not there. The boy was alone on his island of pain. In that moment, all of Isabella's fear dissolved, consumed by an overwhelming wave of protection. This was not a clinical case. This was a child being tortured. The image of her grandmother surfaced in her mind, her gentle, wrinkled hands working with herbs in a clay bowl, the smell of chamomile and earth filling the kitchen. It was an ancient wisdom, an inheritance not measured in dollars or stocks, but in relief and healing. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She could no longer be a spectator. A decision formed inside her, firm and irrevocable. She had no proof to bring to Arthur, no power to confront Beatrice. But she had her hands, and she had her grandmother's knowledge. She would use what she had. She would do what she could. That night, in her small kitchen, under the pale light of the moon, Isabella opened an old, leather-bound notebook. Her hands no longer trembled with fear, but with a newfound purpose. The aroma that filled Isabella's small kitchen was an antithesis to the sterile air of the mansion. It smelled of damp earth, crushed leaves, and a promise of relief. With steady hands, she ground dried herbs in a wooden mortar and pestle, an object that had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before her. Each herb had a purpose, a secret whispered to her on hot afternoons in her childhood: calendula to soothe inflammation, plantain leaf to draw out impurities, and chamomile to soften the skin and the soul. They were treasures of a different kind, an inheritance not listed on a net worth statement or yielding dividends, but whose value was immeasurable. As she worked, transforming the dried leaves into a dark, dense paste, the magnitude of what she was about to do struck her. She was risking everything: her job, her only source of income, her reputation. She imagined the reaction of Arthur, a man accustomed to profitability reports and risk analyses, upon discovering a housekeeper was practicing folk medicine on his son. He would crush her without a second thought. The next day, the small glass jar felt as heavy as solid gold in her purse. She had hidden it inside a clean sock, a humble secret amidst the oppressive luxury of the mansion. Every step through the polished corridors was an exercise in control. She kept her face serene, her hands steady as she cleaned, but inside, her heart was a storm. Beatrice's presence was more intimidating than ever. The nurse seemed to sense a shift in the air, her cold blue eyes landing on Isabella with an inquisitive frequency. She followed her, questioned her cleaning methods, created obstacles, as if trying to catch her in a mistake. Isabella knew she needed an opportunity, a moment when she would be alone with Leo, far from the woman's watchful gaze. But the chance never seemed to come. Beatrice was the boy's shadow, controlling every interaction, every meal, every breath. That afternoon, while cleaning the library, a grand room with walls lined with books that were likely worth a small fortune, she heard Arthur's voice from the adjacent study. He was on the phone, his tone severe and impatient. He mentioned assets, liabilities, and the need to restructure some of his holdings to optimize cash flow. To him, the world was a financial chessboard where people and companies were pieces to be moved to secure a profit. Isabella felt a chill. How could a man so focused on an abstract universe of numbers understand the simple, earthly truth of his son's suffering? The answer was clear. He couldn't. He trusted specialists, imported labels, the science his money could buy. He trusted Beatrice. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just fighting the nurse, she was fighting the fortress of wealth and distrust that Arthur had built around himself and his son. The opportunity arose unexpectedly. Late in the afternoon, a security alarm went off in one of the far wings of the house. It was a false alarm, a faulty sensor, but protocol required Beatrice, as head of staff, to personally verify it with the security team. "Keep an eye on him," the nurse ordered Isabella with a hard look before rushing off. "Don't disturb him." The ensuing silence was deafening. Isabella stood in the hallway, her heart pounding in her throat. It was now or never. With trembling hands, she reached into her purse and retrieved the small jar. The dark paste inside seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. She walked to the door of Leo's room, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in her ears. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. The doorknob was cold beneath her hand. She turned it slowly, pushing the door open, and the soft sound of a creak seemed the loudest noise she had ever heard in her life. Leo flinched on the bed as soon as the door opened. His large, frightened eyes, framed by red, sensitive skin, fixed on Isabella. He saw her every day, but always at a distance, a silent presence in the background of his confined world. To see her now, crossing the threshold of his sanctuary prison, was a breach of protocol, an anomaly in his painfully predictable routine. The room, impeccably clean, was a testament to his father's fortune. Expensive, limited edition toys were perfectly aligned on shelves, untouched. A latest generation gaming console remained off, its dark screen reflecting the silent room. These were the assets of a childhood that was never lived, a portfolio of joy that yielded no interest in the boy's heart. Leo didn't need more possessions, he needed relief. Isabella's heart contracted. All that wealth, all that capital invested in objects couldn't buy a single moment of peace for this child. She approached slowly, her hands visible, holding the small glass jar like an offering. She knelt beside the bed so her eyes were level with his, a gesture of submission and respect. "Leo," she whispered, her voice soft so as not to startle him. "I'm not going to hurt you." He shrank back, pulling the sheet up to his chin, a little soldier defending his last trench. "Nurse Beatrice said no one can touch me without gloves," he murmured, his voice fragile, repeating the doctrine that had been drilled into him. "This is different," Isabella said, remaining calm. She opened the jar, and the earthy, herbal scent floated gently through the air, a stark contrast to the chemical odor that always dominated the room. "This is from the earth. It's my grandmother's recipe. She used to say it was to calm the fire in the skin and help you breathe again." The boy watched her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The word fire resonated with him. That was exactly how it felt, as if his skin were on fire, but distrust was a high wall. He shook his head, an almost imperceptible movement. "It's going to sting," he said, his voice thick with the memory of so many painful treatments. Isabella nodded with a sad smile. She wouldn't lie to him. "Yes, it will sting a little, like a little ant bite, but only for a moment. Then comes the relief, the coolness, Seeing the hesitation in his eyes, Isabella did the only thing that could breach that barrier. With her finger, she scooped up a small amount of the dark paste and, under Leo's watchful gaze, applied it to her own wrist. "See? It's just mud and leaves, a gift from the garden." She waited, letting him observe her skin, her calm face. Time seemed to stand still. Every second was precious. Beatrice could return at any moment. Slowly, as if the movement required all his courage, Leo extended his arm. It was an act of faith, an investment of trust in a world that had only given him pain. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she took a portion of the paste and spread it carefully over one of the most inflamed patches on his forearm. The boy's skin was hot to the touch, feverish. He held his breath, his body tense, waiting for the familiar pain. There was an initial sting, and a small whimper escaped his lips. Isabella continued to spread the ointment in gentle, circular motions, whispering words of comfort, just as her grandmother used to do. And then, something changed. The tension in Leo's small body began to dissipate. His shoulders relaxed. A long, shaky, deep sigh escaped his chest. "It's cool," he murmured, his eyes widening in surprise. That small relief was Isabella's first victory, a dividend of hope in a sea of despair. She smiled, feeling a wave of joy. It had worked. Just as she was wiping her fingers and preparing to put the jar away, a sound cut through the silence. The sharp, metallic click of the doorknob turning. The sound of the clicking doorknob froze time. Isabella looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw the door swing open to reveal the impeccably white figure of Beatrice. The nurse stopped on the threshold, her body rigid, her cold blue eyes sweeping past Isabella, kneeling on the floor and locking like heat-seeking missiles onto Leo's arm. The dark smear of the herbal paste on the boy's inflamed skin was an affront, a flagrant violation of her sterile domain. For an instant, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy with a tension you could physically feel. Beatrice's professional smile vanished, dissolving to reveal a mask of icy fury. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she hissed, the words slipping through clenched teeth. "What do you think you're doing?" The tone was low, but it carried a threat that made the air vibrate. Before Isabella could answer, Beatrice marched to the bed. Her movements were quick, precise, and filled with a contained violence. She grabbed a box of sterile wipes from the nightstand and, with shocking brutality, began to scrub Leo's arm, wiping away the herbal paste with harsh, repetitive motions. Leo let out a whimper of pain, flinching not from the sting of the paste, but from the nurse's rough touch. It was getting cool," he whispered, his voice trembling, a small attempt to defend the brief moment of relief he had experienced. Beatrice ignored him completely, as if he were merely an object to be cleaned. "You are irresponsible," she spun on Isabella, her eyes blazing. "And how dare you apply this backyard mud to a child with a serious medical condition? It could cause an infection, an allergic reaction. Do you have any idea of the danger?" She spoke of danger, but her panic seemed disproportionate, almost hysterical. Isabella rose slowly, her body trembling, but her fear giving way to a courage born of desperation. She looked at Leo's frightened face and then back at Beatrice's fury. "And the only thing I know is that he suffers," Isabella said, her voice quiet but firm. "I hear him cry every night, every single night after you apply your cream, and today, for the first time, I saw him sigh in relief." The words hung in the air, a simple, powerful accusation that Beatrice had not expected. The nurse was momentarily speechless, the wipe stained with dark paste frozen in her hand. For her, who saw her job as a long-term investment, with an income guaranteed by the boy's continued illness, the idea of a simple, cheap cure was more threatening than any infection. This empire of suffering was her personal treasure. She composed herself quickly, tossing the wipe into the trash with a contemptuous flick of her wrist. Snatching the glass jar from Isabella's hand, she examined it as if it were poison. This is garbage. The witchcraft of ignorant people who don't understand science. She turned to leave. But before she did, she glanced at Leo's arm, now clean and already turning red again from the friction. It was then that Isabella saw it. Under the lamplight, in the brief moment the boy's skin had been covered by the paste, the inflammation surrounding the main sore looked visibly calmer. The aggressive redness had subsided to a soft pink. Beatrice saw it too. Her gaze fixed on the spot, and her mask of professional rage faltered. For a millisecond, what flashed in her eyes was not indignation, but something far deeper and more telling, a glint of pure, cold panic. She looked at Isabella, her fury replaced by a calculated coldness. "Don't you ever come near him again," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "This is your final warning. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Isabella was dismissed early that day, Beatrice's threat echoing in her ears. The nurse, a master of manipulation, assured her that Arthur would be informed of her dangerous attempt to medicate the child. The fear returned, stronger than ever, but now it was mixed with a stubborn determination. The glimpse of relief on Leo's face and the panic in Beatrice's eyes had strengthened her conviction. She knew she was on the right path, but she was being forced out of the game. The next morning, Isabella returned to work with her head held high but her heart heavy. She stuck strictly to her cleaning duties in other wings of the house, avoiding Leo's floor. The mansion felt quieter, the tension almost palpable. While cleaning the entrance hall, she heard Arthur's voice from his study, louder and harsher than usual. He was on the phone, talking about a high-risk investment that had soured, threatening a quarter's profits. "Don't give me liabilities. I want solutions. Profitability cannot drop," he yelled, revealing the intensity and impatience that guided his business dealings. His mind was fixed on millions of dollars and maintaining his vast capital, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding just a few feet away. The unexpected turning point came at lunchtime. Isabella was mopping the kitchen floor, bent over her work, when she heard hurried footsteps. It was Arthur, but his face was no longer tense with worry about the stock market. It was pale and distorted by a much more primal fear. He walked quickly towards the pantry, speaking on his phone in a choked voice Isabella had never heard before. "Yes, doctor, he's running a high fever, and the sores, they're much worse than usual. Yes, the usual treatment, the ointment and the supplement." His voice trailed off as he entered the pantry. Isabella stopped mopping, her heart leaping into her chest. Leo's condition had worsened drastically. What followed was a succession of events that took her by surprise. Arthur emerged from the pantry with a large bottle of an electrolyte solution and a look of desperation. He walked past Isabella without seeing her, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The sound of light, quick steps came from the hallway, and Beatrice appeared, but she wasn't coming from Leo's room. She was coming from the laundry room, her face flushed and her hair slightly disheveled, which was unusual for her always impeccable appearance. She looked nervous, but was trying to hide it. "What is it, Mr. King?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky. "Leo, he has a fever," Arthur said, hurrying towards the stairs. "His sores are terribly inflamed. I've never seen them like this." Beatrice paled. "But I just applied the ointment. I was just with him." She hurried after Arthur, but not before casting a quick, furtive glance at the laundry room door, which Isabella noticed had been left ajar. And it was that detail, that single, tiny slip from a woman who was always so controlled and flawless, that ignited a light in Isabella's mind. Why was she in the laundry room if Leo was sick? Why the instant denial? Suddenly, a new and terrible suspicion arose. Driven by an instinct that overrode all fear, Isabella dropped the mop and rushed to the laundry room. The smell of soap and fabric softener was strong, but in the corner, on a countertop, was a metal trash can. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, hidden under a pile of used face towels, was something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the small, dark bottle of the supplement, but another identical bottle. It was empty and tossed aside, as if discarded in a hurry. And the label, indecipherable in a foreign language, was the same shape and size. Beatrice's panic suddenly made sense. She wasn't just keeping Leo sick, she was dosing something, perhaps increasing the dose or switching one bottle for another. Isabella picked up the empty bottle, the glass cold in her hand. It wasn't what she had suspected, not just the ointment. It was the oral supplement. She needed a sample of the ointment and a sample of the liquid. And she had only one way to get them. She would have to risk it one last time, enter Leo's room and take a small portion of both. She had very little time before Arthur returned with the doctor. The chance was slim, but Leo's life depended on it. The small empty bottle felt heavy in her hand, a treasure of proof worth more than all of Arthur's capital. With the cold, empty vial in her palm, Isabella felt a sharp clarity cut through her panic. This small glass object was proof of a lie, the key to a mystery that was consuming Leo's life. The voices of Arthur and Beatrice, muffled by the distance, reached her like a call to action. The high fever, the sudden decline. It was the opportunity that fate, cruelly, was offering her. It was an absurd risk, a gamble against a house whose owner was a multi-billionaire who could crush her with a single phone call. But Leo's feverish face overshadowed all fear. She climbed the stairs, not as a housekeeper, but as a soldier on a stealth mission. Each marble step seemed to amplify the sound of her heart, a war drum against the oppressive silence of the mansion. The polished wood banister, worth more than everything she owned, was cold and indifferent under her trembling hand. She was invading the heart of the empire to steal its secrets. The door to Leo's room was open. The scene inside was one of quiet desperation. Leo lay still, his small body shivering under the expensive sheets, his face flushed and slick with sweat. Arthur was beside him, clumsy in his helplessness, dabbing a damp cloth on his son's forehead. All his vast net worth, his ability to manipulate the stock market and forecast the cash flow of complex businesses, was useless here. He couldn't buy his son's health with gold or cryptocurrency. Beatrice, on the other hand, moved with a calculated efficiency, preparing an ice pack. Her expression controlled, but her eyes flashing with an anxiety she could barely conceal. A fever is a normal reaction in children with dermal sensitivity, she was telling Arthur, her voice falsely reassuring. The important thing is to maintain the treatment routine without interruption. Isabella entered the room like a ghost. She carried a bucket and a cloth, the perfect cover for her presence. Arthur, lost in his anguish, barely noticed her. Beatrice shot her a warning look, but was too busy managing the crisis to pay her full attention. The nightstand was her target. There they were, the white jar of medicinal ointment and the small, dark bottle of the supplement, identical to the one she had found empty. Her heart hammered. She moved closer, pretending to dust a nearby lamp. Leo's eyes, cloudy with fever, met hers for a second. There was no fear in them, just a mute appeal, a faint recognition of the woman who had offered him a moment of coolness. That look was all the fuel Isabella needed. In her apron, she carried 2 minuscule sample pots, the kind she usually used for testing cleaning products. Her hands, hidden by the nightstand, worked with desperate speed. First, the ointment. She opened the white jar, and the familiar chemical scent hit her. With the tip of a cotton swab from her pocket, she took a tiny amount and transferred it to one of her pots. She sealed it, her heart in her throat. Now, the harder part, the liquid. The bottle was nearly full. Unscrewing the cap without making a sound seemed an impossible task. Taking a deep breath, she picked it up. Her fingers trembled so much she almost dropped it. With infinite delicacy, she twisted the cap. A tiny, almost inaudible click. She tilted the bottle, and a few dark, thick drops fell into her second sample pot. Relief washed over her. So strong it made her dizzy. She had done it. She was sealing her small pot, ready to pocket it and disappear, when a deep, confused voice cut through the tense air of the room. "Isabella!" Arthur had turned. He was no longer looking at Leo. He was looking directly at her guilty hands hovering over the nightstand. His eyes narrowed, confusion giving way to sharp suspicion. "What are you doing over there?" Isabella's world shrank to that single point in space, the Persian rug under her knees, the cold nightstand under her fingers, and Arthur's sharp, inquisitive eyes boring into her. The air grew thin. The sound of Leo's feverish breathing seemed a distant echo. Time stretched, each second weighing a ton. She needed an answer, a plausible lie that could buy her time, but her mind, once so clear, was now a vortex of panic. The small samples in her pocket seemed to burn through the fabric, tiny incandescent secrets betraying her. I saw a smudge," she stammered, her voice coming out weak and shaky. "I thought one of the jars was leaking. I was just going to wipe it." The excuse was flimsy, threadbare, and she knew the moment the words left her mouth that it wouldn't be enough. Beatrice, seeing her golden opportunity, moved in like a predator. "Leaking? That's absurd," she said, her voice like the crack of a whip. She turned to Arthur, her expression a mask of professional concern and outrage. "Mr. King, this is a serious breach of every protocol. Contamination." Her hands, covered in cleaning chemicals, touching the medication of a child with a compromised immune system. "It's an unacceptable risk. Our entire investment in a sterile environment, all of our careful work, could be undone by an act of negligence like this." She used the word investment deliberately, a sharp weapon aimed at Arthur where he was most sensitive. Leo's health was, to him, a project, a valuable asset that was depreciating before his eyes, and Beatrice was framing Isabella as a dangerous liability, an uncontrolled variable threatening his entire portfolio of care. Arthur looked from Beatrice, the professional in whom he placed an astronomical amount of money and trust, to Isabella, the housekeeper who earned minimum wage. The equation in his mind was simple and brutal. On one side, an expensive specialist with a logical explanation. On the other, a low-level employee with a flimsy excuse. The decision was instant, driven by a father's paralyzing fear. "Get out," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. It was the same tone he used to fire executives who missed their profit targets. "Get your things and leave my house, now." The sentence was final, a gavel striking an anvil. Isabella felt the floor disappear from under her, fired, humiliated. But amidst the sharp pain of injustice, a current of relief washed over her. He wasn't accusing her of theft. He didn't ask to see what was in her hands or her pockets. He just wanted her gone. She stood up, her legs wobbly. She didn't dare look at Leo, afraid the sight of his sick face would make her break down. "Yes, sir," she whispered, and turned. Every step out of that room was torture. She could feel Beatrice's eyes on her back, victorious and cold. She walked down the stairs, her heart still hammering, but now with a different rhythm, the rhythm of urgency. She had the evidence. That was all that mattered. She passed through the entrance hall, a blur of marble and gold, her mind already working on the next step. She needed to find a lab. She needed help. She just wanted to grab her purse from the small staff locker and disappear before Arthur changed his mind. Her hand was on the front doorknob, freedom just a step away, when a firm voice stopped her. "Ms. Isabella." It was the head of security, a tall, impassive man who always ignored her. He stood a few feet away, blocking her path. "Mr. King has requested that you do not leave yet. Please, come with me to the study." Arthur's study was the heart of his financial empire, a sanctuary of power and control. The walls were paneled in dark, polished wood, adorned not with family photos, but with framed charts showing the meteoric rise of his stocks and the exponential growth of his net worth. It was a room that smelled of expensive leather and victory, a place where multi-million-dollar deals were closed and fortunes were made or lost with a single voice command. Isabella felt minuscule as she entered, an intruder in the nerve center of a wealth she could barely comprehend. The head of security led her inside and then stood silently by the door, an impassive guardian of all those secrets and assets. Arthur was not sitting behind his imposing desk. He was standing with his back to the door, looking through the bulletproof window at the perfectly manicured garden. He didn't turn when she entered. The silence he imposed was a tactic, a tool to unnerve opponents in boardrooms, and it was working. "I built everything I have from nothing. Mrs. Isabella," he said at last, his voice calm and dangerously low, still facing away. "I understand people. I understand motivations. I know that nothing happens without a reason. Greed, revenge, opportunity. So I will ask you this only once, and I suggest you be honest. Who sent you?" Isabella blinked, confused. "Sent me? No one sent me, sir. Don't lie to me." He spun around, and the cold fury in his eyes silenced her. "Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think I believe that story about wiping a smudge? Is someone trying to sue me? A business rival? Someone looking to tarnish my name to drive my stock price down?" He saw her not as a concerned housekeeper, but as a pawn in a corporate chess game. In his world, everything was a transaction, a calculation of risk and reward. Compassion was not a variable in his equations. Isabella's panic turned to indignation. "Sir," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed, "with all due respect to your money and your business, you don't understand anything. Your son is sick. He is suffering. And I believe the cause is in those jars on his nightstand." She took a step forward, her desperation making her bold. "Nurse Beatrice, she isn't curing Leo. She's keeping him sick." The accusation hung in the air, so heavy and unbelievable that Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh. "Ah, I see it now. It's blackmail. You invent some ridiculous conspiracy theory to extort me. How much do you want? 100,000? 200? Is that your investment plan?" The mention of money, of capital, of earning interest on a child's suffering was the final straw. "I don't want your money," Isabella cried, tears finally welling in her eyes. "I want you to save your son. Look at him. Do you ever really look at him, or do you just sign the checks for his treatment?" For an instant, Arthur's facade cracked. Isabella's accusation had hit home, echoing a deep guilt he'd carried since his wife's death. He remembered her, how she trusted her instincts, how she would have known what to do, but that memory was quickly smothered by the fear and cold logic that guided him. Trusting a housekeeper over a certified medical professional was an unacceptable risk, an illogical bet. He rebuilt his steel mask. "Enough. The guard will search you. I want your phone, your purse, everything in your pockets. You will stay in the East Wing guest room until my lawyers and my private medical team arrive in the morning. You will go nowhere and speak to no one." He turned away. The matter closed. "Take her," he ordered the guard. The man moved toward Isabella, his hand outstretched. She was trapped. The evidence she had risked everything to get was inches from being discovered, and she was utterly alone, a prisoner in this golden palace. The security guard's hand was large and firm, a wall of flesh and bone between Isabella and freedom. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a threat in itself. "Your purse and the contents of your pockets, please," he said, his voice neutral, devoid of any emotion. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her hope. Isabella could feel the outline of the small pots in her apron, 2 plastic hearts beating against her leg. They were her only weapon, the only proof she wasn't crazy, and they were about to be confiscated and dismissed as trash. Arthur, standing by the window, watched the scene with a cold detachment, like a general observing a routine maneuver. To him, this was just problem management, neutralizing a risk to his most precious assets. Isabella looked at him, one last desperate attempt to breach the fortress of suspicion his fortune had built. "Mr. King," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "and forget about me, forget what you think I am. Just go to your son's room, smell that ointment, ask yourself why he only gets worse after it's applied. You're a businessman. You understand patterns, cause and effect. Ignore me, but don't ignore the facts." Her words were met with stony silence. Arthur didn't move. He had already made his judgment, analyzed the data, and come to a conclusion. In his assessment, she was a liability to be contained. The guard took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. It was at that exact moment, when all hope seemed lost, that the intercom on Arthur's desk buzzed, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Arthur pressed the button with an irritated gesture. The voice that exploded from the speaker was not Beatrice's, controlled and professional. It was a scream of pure panic. "Mr. King, quickly, it's Leo. He's not breathing right. He's turning blue." Arthur's world stopped spinning. The mask of control, of power, of unshakable wealth shattered into a million pieces. The billionaire vanished, and in his place stood a terrified father. The color drained from his face. For an instant, he was paralyzed, horror etched in his eyes. Then he moved, a blur of panic and desperation. He sprinted past the guard, shoving the study door with a force that made it slam against the wall. His heavy footsteps echoed down the hall as he ran towards the stairs, his only thought fixed on the one inheritance that truly mattered. The explosion of chaos was Isabella's chance. The guard, caught off guard, hesitated for a split second, his instincts torn between following his boss and obeying the order to watch her. It was enough time. With a speed she didn't know she possessed, Isabella darted to the corner of the study, where a large ceramic planter held a lush fern. Her hands plunged into the cool, damp soil. She didn't care about the dirt under her nails, about desecrating this immaculate environment. With trembling fingers, she dug a small hole, placed the 2 sample pots inside, and quickly covered them with soil, smoothing the surface. The entire act took no more than 5 seconds. When the guard turned back to her, his expression confused, she was standing, breathless, her hands soiled with earth. He stared at her, suspicion warring with the urgency of the crisis unfolding upstairs. "What did you do?" he growled, taking a step toward her. But before he could grab her, Arthur's voice screamed from upstairs, a sound of pure agony. "Call an ambulance, now!" Arthur's cry, "Call an ambulance, now!" was a shockwave that shattered the house's paralysis. The security guard, forgetting Isabella completely, bolted towards the stairs, his radio already in his hand, barking orders to the front gate. The chaos was Isabella's shield. As everyone's attention turned to the drama upstairs, she ran to the small staff closet near the kitchen. Her sample pots were safe in the soil, but they were useless now. They were evidence for a future battle, but Leo was in a war that had to be won this instant. Inside her purse, wrapped in a clean cloth, was the main jar of her herbal paste, the remedy she had prepared with such faith and risked everything to use. It was all she had. With the jar in hand, she didn't hesitate. She raced up the stairs, the steps that once represented fear and oppression, now the path to the only thing that mattered. She reached the upstairs hallway, and the scene that met her froze her for a second. Beatrice was trying to place an oxygen mask on Leo's face, but the boy, in his feverish delirium, was thrashing weakly. Arthur was on the phone, yelling at what sounded like a doctor, his voice cracking with panic. "His pulse is weak. He's pale. All my money is worthless if—" He stopped when he saw Isabella approaching, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "I told you to get out," he snarled, but Isabella wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Leo. "He's burning up," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the chaos. "This will help draw the heat out." Before anyone could stop her, she knelt beside Leo, who was now lying on a rug in the hallway. With stunning speed, she opened her jar. The strong, earthy scent of the herbs filled the air, overpowering the smell of disinfectant and sickness. Arthur and Beatrice were frozen in shock at her audacity. With her bare hands, Isabella scooped up a generous amount of the dark paste and began applying it to Leo's chest and arms. The boy's skin was scorching hot. The moment the cool paste touched his feverish body, the thermal shock and the initial sting of the herbs made him react. A sharp, frightened cry escaped his pale lips. To Isabella, it was the expected sound, the body's reaction as it began to fight back. But to Arthur, that cry was the confirmation of his worst nightmare. The scene before him paralyzed him with horror. The housekeeper, whom he already suspected of ulterior motives, was kneeling over his son, slathering him with a dark, sinister-looking substance from a jar with a hand-drawn label, an ancient symbol that, to his terrified mind, looked like a skull. His son's scream was the soundtrack to his greatest failure as a father. Blinded by panic, he lunged forward. "Get your hands off him!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with terror. He knocked the jar from Isabella's hand, its contents splattering across the expensive rug. His eyes fell on the handwritten label with the names of the herbs. He didn't recognize most, but one of them, vaguely, he recalled reading somewhere was toxic if ingested. He didn't think twice. His business logic, his risk analysis, all boiled down to one terrible conclusion. His legacy, his only son, was being poisoned before his very eyes. Grabbing Leo's limp body, he scrambled to his feet. "You poisoned him!" he screamed at Isabella, his face contorted with hate and fear. He ran past Beatrice, who watched with wide eyes. He thundered down the stairs, yelling for the driver who was already waiting at the door. "To the hospital! Quickly! She poisoned him!" He threw himself into the back of the car, clutching his son to his chest, leaving behind a stunned Isabella, kneeling in the hallway, her grandmother's remedies staining the floor like dark blood. The hospital was a world of white and rhythmic beeps, a sterile contrast to the emotional chaos Arthur carried within him. He paced the emergency room hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Every beep from the monitor Leo was hooked up to was a blow to his chest. He had failed. His entire empire, all his fortune, all his power to manipulate markets and forecast the cash flow of nations couldn't protect his son. Worse, he felt he had allowed evil into his home, disguised as a housekeeper. The anger and fear were a poison in his own blood when an older doctor with grey hair and an air of experienced calm approached. Arthur lunged, holding out Isabella's jar. "This," he said, his voice raw. "She put this on him." He screamed, "It's poison. Pump his stomach, test his blood, do whatever it takes." The doctor took the jar with a steady hand. He looked at the contents, sniffed it lightly, and then turned to look at Leo through the glass of the treatment room. The boy was calmer now, his breathing more regular, though he was still pale and exhausted. The doctor turned his gaze back to Arthur, and there was no alarm in his eyes, only a thoughtful curiosity. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet, "this isn't poison. It's an old folk remedy, an herbal poultice. My own grandmother used to make something similar." Arthur stared at him, incredulous. But he screamed. "I heard him." "Yes," the doctor agreed. "The initial sting is normal, especially on skin that's so inflamed. It's the herb's reaction drawing out the fever and inflammation. In fact," he paused, looking at the boy again, "the inflammation around his sores, it's lessening." Arthur, in shock, moved to the glass. He looked at his son's arm, where the dark paste had been partially cleaned away by the nurses, and he saw it. It was subtle, but undeniable. The furious red that ringed the open sores looked softer, less aggressive. The swelling seemed to have receded slightly. A seed of doubt began to sprout amidst his panic, a small, nagging question. What if he was wrong? The final twist came a few hours later with the lab results. The hospital lab found no trace of poison or herbal toxins in Leo's system. However, the blood work showed something the doctor found troubling. "No, we found traces of an industrial chemical compound," the doctor explained, showing Arthur the report. "It's a potent skin irritant. It's not lethal in small doses, but continued exposure can cause the exact symptoms your son presents, including the fever in more acute reactions. Has he been in contact with any strong chemicals?" Arthur shook his head, confused. "No, of course not. The house is completely controlled. Everything is hypoallergenic." And then he remembered Beatrice. The ointment. He uses an imported medicinal ointment, a very expensive one, and an oral supplement. He had brought Leo's bag of medications in the desperation of his flight. At the doctor's request, a sample of Beatrice's white ointment was sent for an urgent analysis. The result was the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that demolished Arthur's world. The industrial chemical compound found in Leo's blood was the same one found in high concentration in the ointment. The nurse wasn't treating the sores, she was creating and perpetuating them day after day to maintain her lucrative job and her control over the house. Arthur didn't collapse from grief. He collapsed from shame. The feeling was physical, as if the floor had opened up and he was falling into a dark abyss. Every cruel word he'd said to Isabella, every accusation, every look of contempt came back to haunt him. He had accused, humiliated, and imprisoned the only person who had actually tried to heal his son. He had trusted the expensive label and the professional facade, ignoring the simple truth a humble woman had tried to show him. Beatrice was detained at the hospital, her charade undone under the fluorescent lights, but Arthur barely registered it. Humiliated, he returned to his empty mansion, a king returning to a ruined castle. He had to face the woman he had treated so unjustly. He had to face the fact that all his money, his entire net worth, was worthless against the simple wisdom and courage of a housekeeper. And he had no idea how to begin to ask for forgiveness. The mansion was silent when Arthur returned. The silence was different now. It was no longer the sterile, controlled quiet of before, but a profound emptiness that echoed his failure. Every luxury object, every work of art, every square foot of that vast estate seemed to mock him. A testament to his blindness, he didn't send for Isabella. He went to find her himself. He found her in the small staff room, sitting on a simple chair, her purse in her lap, waiting. She didn't look scared or angry, just infinitely tired. When she saw him, she stood, her body tensing, ready for the final blow. But the blow never came. Instead, the multi-billionaire, the titan of industry who made Wall Street tremble, crumbled. He didn't kneel, but his posture, his face, everything about him was an act of surrender. "I'm sorry." The word came out as a hoarse whisper, a foreign sound in a voice accustomed to giving orders. I was blinded by arrogance, by fear, by money. I built an empire to protect my son, and in the process, I built walls so high they blocked out the only person who actually tried to save him." Isabella remained silent, letting his words hang in the air. She saw the genuine shame in his eyes, the pain of a man who finally understood the scale of his mistake. There was no more calculation, no risk analysis, just a broken human being. "Leo will need care when he comes home," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, bringing the focus back to what mattered. "He'll need someone who understands how to heal his skin and his trust." Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, and that's why I'm begging you, please, stay." He paused, searching for the right words. "Not as a housekeeper. I'm not worthy of you cleaning my floors. Stay as his caregiver, as an advisor. Teach me to see what I can't. Your knowledge is worth more than all my assets combined. Please, Isabella." The healing was a slow, quiet process, like a seed sprouting in dark earth. Leo came home, and under Isabella's care, the transformation was miraculous. The herbal salves, applied with gentle hands, not only soothed the fire in his skin, but also seemed to heal the fear in his soul. Slowly, the sores closed, giving way to new, healthy skin, and with the healing of the body came the healing of the spirit. The silent, frightened boy began to smile, then to laugh. The sound of his laughter, echoing through the once silent halls, was to Arthur the highest and most successful dividend he had ever received. He learned to set aside the profit and loss statements and sit on the floor to build a puzzle. He learned that the greatest investment he could make was his time. He would watch Isabella, marveling at a wisdom that didn't come from business textbooks, but from the heart. The gratitude he felt for her blossomed into respect, and the respect naturally and inevitably deepened into a quiet, profound love. It was a love born not of passion, but of admiration for the strength, integrity, and kindness she embodied. Months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, the mansion's garden, once a flawless and lifeless set piece, was bursting with color and fragrance. Isabella had planted flowers and herbs, bringing life back to the soil. Leo, his skin clear and his face radiant, chased a butterfly, his laughter floating on the air. Arthur stood beside Isabella, no longer as boss and employee, but as two equals. He looked at his son, a pure, simple joy, filling the space in his chest once occupied by guilt. Then he turned to the woman who had healed his family from the inside out. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand. In that touch, a promise was made. The fortress of glass and steel had finally become a home. The ruins in his heart had been rebuilt, not with gold or stock options, but with the strongest, most valuable materials of all: forgiveness, trust, and love.